Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the closing event of hardwear.io. I hope you enjoyed so far the conference and also the other events that have been organized outside. So really, really happy to be here moderating at the hardwear.io CXO panel, security certification for IoT devices. Well, we are here for notable gentlemen from the industry. We have Cory from Google, we have Roberto Avanzi from ARM, then we have Rob from NCC Group, and Stefano Zanero from Politecnico di Milano. I will just leave the word immediately to them to make an overview and to a bit of introduction. But I would also pass along the first question. What are your views on security certification? And if your organization is involved in any way, would you like to share anything interesting regarding this topic? Please, Cory.
So, hello everyone. I'm Cory Scott. I'm at Google Nest. I head up security and privacy for that part of the organization. And as far as answering the first question regarding certification, the Google is definitely involved both by providing feedback to governmental and non-profit organizations for industry certifications, as well as attempting to build in good certifications for the people who manufacture components for our devices. So,
thank you, Roberto.
We have to share the mic.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm Roberto. I'm an architect at ARM, also the resident cryptographer, and doing security analysis for the architecture team. And I kind of share both worlds because I have an academic background and I was at university before selling my soul to industry. So you wanted to hear something about the first question. Yes, at ARM, we believe certification for security is important. We have historically not been done much in this area because we were just delivering the iron in as well, the silicon. And not even that, the blueprints for the silicon. But as people familiar with some things like this say, know that now we'll have to certify how some of our stuff is being used. So this is the type of process that is starting at ARM.
Rob, please.
Rob Wood, NCC Group. I run our hardware and embedded systems practice, and one of the things that we do quite a lot is help our customers who are building embedded devices of all sorts. In particular, regarding certifications, a couple of our clients have actually started their own certification program. If you would like to kind of connect to their network, use their technology, you have to have your device has to pass certain certifications that they've set out. But almost all of these are kind of a bare minimum. None of them are like setting a very high bar, but they're trying to change the whole ecosystem at once. And right now there's not a lot of security, as we all know, in some of these low cost devices.
I'm Stefano. I'm from academia, and contrary to what Roberto said, we don't sell souls because we don't have any. Before joining academia, I actually had a soul, and I created a penetration testing company, one of Italy's oldest. So I've had my fair share of looking at devices and trying to figure out how to say that they were secure enough. I'm currently involved in several certification working groups, both in the area of the Cybersecurity Act and in the area of medical devices.
Thank you. Well, brief introduction. I'm Cristofaro. I will be moderating this panel without any soul at all. I will just be brain and no heart, and I will be painful as much as I can. I'm just teasing a bit. No, the reason for this panel is that, of course, everybody understands that the need for certification devices. We need to improve, and the famous raise the bar for attackers and so on. There are several initiatives which are not always thought together. Then we have a regulatory framework like EU Cybersecurity Act and ENISA. We have a PSA from ARM certification, and Roberto, I think, is going to touch a few bits here and there whenever possible. I think it was about time to ask a few questions which are not often asked. And the next one is actually, in the end, We know that security devices actually come from a very long supply chain, and from yesterday from Axel has beautifully touched on this. So in the end, the final outcome in the device is a product, an outcome of the entire industry. So the question is that, is the OEM, the entire OEM, responsible for the entire device security, an effective way of approaching IoT security? Or do you think there are better ways for approaching this in a sustainable way? Who wants to take the question first? Go ahead.
I can take a stab.
Yes.
So fundamentally, when you're, as a consumer, you're buying a product, a car, a computer, whatever it is, you're giving money to, Best Buy or GM or someone, and you're getting this piece of machinery. If it has any security issues, that's who you should be going to get your money back. And that's the way, like if I go buy a Wi-Fi router at Best Buy, it doesn't work or it's not secure, I'm going to take it back to Best Buy, I'll get my money back. And it's then up to them to go to their supplier and get their money back, and so on up the chain. So, if that security vulnerability happens to be somewhere deep in the firmware, then it might have to go quite far up the supply chain. But there's kind of like a tree diagram of blame, essentially. So it all rolls uphill.
So one of the things that I would like to see is greater accountability across the ecosystem. So not just all the way to the final OEM of a given product. Requiring that amount of security certification really stifles innovation in the industry, because you have to have security expertise in a lot of very niche areas applied to every manufacturer of every product. If you look at something like typical like food safety regulation, someone who opens up a bakery is not responsible for determining the safety of the flour, the safety of the eggs, the safety of the milk. Instead, they rely on existing sets of certifications and regulations about how those things are handled until they get to the bakery. And then, of course, they're responsible for safe handling of it to the final product.
So if I understand correctly, you are suggesting that there should be also intermediate certification component level that might help in spreading the risk towards the chain. Is this correct? My understanding?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Roberto, are you on the same page?
I am on the same page. In fact, as you said, of course, if I buy something like a smartphone from a particular manufacturer, that's the first place where I go if I have a problem of any kind, not only security. Yep. But it's basically an interface, the first interface for addressing these problems. Responsibility, of course, is something different. I mean, it might be, for instance, there's a security problem that is in the modem they used, and they're not the developers of this modem or whatever the component is. So as he said, of course, we then one has to be able to go back and find in a clear way where the security issue originated. Mm-hmm. So, and that's actually the responsibility I think you are talking about. And of course, that's also the path that is important if regulators and organizations needed then to intervene to address these issues.
Yeah. It's also worth saying that the OEM also takes the initial bad press and blame for everything in the end. So these also need to be understood as an additional risk. And Stefano, you want to add anything?
Yeah, actually, there's one thing that comes to mind about this, and the example that comes to mind for me at least is not really cheap consumer level example, but the automotive industry. And there you have a very clear picture of this, because you have your average car owner takes it up with the manufacturer for whatever, from defects to vulnerabilities to whatever else. That the manufacturer is their interface, of course. And the manufacturers have had an interesting conundrum in these years, because on the one hand, they've wanted to push their security needs towards the tier ones and throughout the supply chain. And on the other hand, they found out, much to their dismay, that they couldn't. Because, of course, security is a systemic issue, right? It's the final integrator that needs to figure out how the different pieces fit together. They can push towards their tier ones security requirements, but they need to figure out a way to do it, which is not that easy if you think about it. Writing the specs for an automotive component and including security specs is absolutely not easy. I have seen tests where basically the OEM would say, oh, okay, tier 1, create for me a head unit that is secure. And the tier 1 would come up with a unit and say, yeah, this is perfectly okay. And because secure does not mean anything unless you specify what you actually wanted to do or not do or accept or not accept. What is the context? So when you test that head unit, which is perfectly well done in the context of the vehicle, it actually doesn't work as intended. Yeah. So, that's the issue that I see with breaking down the certification process and sending it throughout the supply chain. It's actually something that is easy to imagine, but very difficult to write down in specs.
Yep. So this actually means that the OEMs will need to take the blame for quite a bit of time, but also in many situations it is also the party that take the least margin along the chain. Usually the margin actually diminishes along the chain until arrive to the OEM. So basically you will be in the situation where you are the one that earns the least, takes the blame, but also needs to take the responsibility for certifying the device. So how much can you afford at that point to test securely something? It shouldn't be something that we need to take into consideration if we really want to have secure devices.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of the security eventually is going to be passed on to the consumer. There's no way around that. But fundamentally, I mean, you have a chain of suppliers. If you're requiring that your suppliers give you secure firmware and secure SoCs, then you need to make sure that that's in your contracts with them. So if you do have a defect, then it's on them to fix it. And so you should have a contractual obligation to roll that uphill.
Do you think they are there, this contractual obligation already?
It's there for some things like safety and quality, but security is often overlooked in my experience.
Yeah. Cory, what is your experience at Google Nest? I mean, do you have this kind of agreement as well with parties up the chain in terms of responsibility? If you want to share, of course.
So we definitely have certain specifications that we provide to our suppliers to ensure certain levels of security, and if the product is not delivered within those operational requirements, there are, of course, penalties and such for that. So I think it goes down a little bit to what Stefano was saying is that you have to make sure that the recipe that you're building, I'm sorry, I'm going to be on a bakery kind of tilt today, is actually something that's sound in the first place, because otherwise you could still do unsafe things. So we try to make sure that the cost is appropriately balanced. Yeah.
Stefano and Roberto, into this question, then should we find a way of pushing the threat model or either down or absorb a more understanding of the threat model? Because that should be a way of saying, hey, I want to have a product that more or less is going to be tested along this condition. Would that make sense? Would that help in a way to build the product, for example?
So what Stefano said, of course, that security is a completely empty word if we don't define against what we're defending against. So we need a threat model first, as also you mentioned. So that's why it is very important that any such process begins with a precise and complete threat model. And then you derive from these the requirements for each and every component you're going to source. And so you're going also to ask these and in a provable way from the people you're buying components from. If this is not done in a very rigorous way, then there will always be holes in the system. And we know that a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And we can't afford this, especially now that the stakes are getting higher with security being very tightly bound also with safety. And I mean, a car is a smartphone with wheels that weighs at least 1 ton. It can become a killing thing. So we really need to step up these efforts, and so they have to be very precisely bound in contractual obligations. So the contracts should include these things. And of course, if then the suppliers further outsource, then we will have to request that they request the same from their own suppliers.
Yeah, it's so the complex part is yes, of course, the threat model needs to be passed down, but the threat model changes, right? While you break it down, it changes form. So it's actually a thing that I have devoted some thought to, and I'm happy that it actually kind of emerges every time that there's this discussion, because it means that I'm not completely crazy. I'm crazy, but not that completely crazy. And it's actually a very complex thing to do intellectually. If you want to generalize this, it's a very complex thing to do. And I don't think that in at least in the industries that I have looked at, there is either a good process to do this or good tools to support this. Threat model specific and specs in the automotive world are passed down in the glorious format of documents, or like Word documents, and they are archived in shared folders. That's the entire management system for these things. So when you change the vehicle, you basically copy the folder and try to edit the specs. So it's actually amazing to me that cars actually move around on the roads and do not fall apart right there where they are.
So you're basically saying that we are the only one that are getting older, but not the systems. They're still there.
The systems are still exactly the same as they were like 20 years ago.
Impressive.
So just an additional note about the threat modeling is, I could have a general purpose microcontroller, and if I put that into an IKEA light bulb, that's a vastly different threat model than if I put that exact same component into like a military jet. And so when you have a platform provider, and we work with a lot of chip vendors, and when they're creating a general thing, the threat model that they're building that to has to support the whole spectrum of what the end product is going to be, and that's not always predictable. You don't know what people are going to create with it.
No, that's why my question was also if we shouldn't think of pushing that up, such as that the final OEM says, I need this kind of device for this purpose. Can you give me, let's say, a component that has been either engineered or designed or tested along the guidelines or not?
Can I raise a point that will make this even more complex? Because, of course, I'm an academic, so that's why you're here. That's my expertise, raising complex questions that cannot be answered.
Yeah.
Actually, it's one step further, because the very same final product can have different threat models. If you pick up the same Volvo with the same self-driving kit by Otto, and it's sold to a consumer, or it's sold to a city for their ride-sharing system, or it's sold to Uber for their fleet, the threat model for that vehicle is completely different. Yes. And it's the same product. Correct. So what threat model do we test it against? If we want to run certification, it's actually a very significant problem with security certifications.
Yeah. It's not uncommon that you have that a very specific product is certified for some use cases and not for other ones. So that would be just not an exception. And I think the processes for handling different scenarios are already in place.
Oh yeah, sure.
So
it's just one further layer of complexity on top of the product versus the components. It's also the product in which configuration and for which use, which is an additional layer.
Great. So, but does this make all these, many people request certification to be mandated by governments, by regulatory framework? We need to do something. This must be mandated. Is it even possible to mandate something that we don't even understand? My question. What do we want to mandate? Or wouldn't it be better that maybe when instead of mandating something, we make desirable, such as the security becomes a bit of the value according to the chain, along the chain, rather than just mandating that? I'm just being a bit provocative, and I'm pretty sure that people have very different views also in the audience.
So my view on most security certifications is that they don't tell you what you have to do to make your product secure. They tell you what you should avoid doing to make it insecure. And so it's kind of a minimum bar. If you do everything correctly, if you set your bar as high as you can, then getting these certifications is mostly just a documentation exercise to take your existing requirements and then putting that in whatever form the framework requires it to be documented under, because they're almost always a lower bar than you should have set for yourself. Where we run into problems is where it's compliance driven, and people are like, well, I just need to get this certified so I can sell an extra 100,000 units. But they haven't done any of the groundwork to make a secure product to begin with. And so now it's, how do I raise myself to that low bar? But if you're just trying to document a low bar when you've already got a high bar, it should be much easier.
So in economics, there's the concept of the market for lemons, which you might have heard of, where you have a bunch of, for example, used cars that they're all, and several of them may end up being lemons, but you as a consumer can't inspect it, you can't look under the hood, you can't figure it out. And so the price that you'll pay for any given car is very low because you're assuming that you might get a lemon as a result. And it happens when you have this asymmetry of information, is that a consumer today cannot look at a bunch of different devices and say, okay, I think that one's more secure than that one. They rely on things such as brand and experience with a particular company, rather than having any type of independent, meaningful certification. And so the problem is that you'd end up, when you do actually document the kind of what that baseline is, it does have an adverse effect on the market, because it forces people to kind of align to that standard, and you better have a good one, because otherwise what you end up with is, as Rob said, a compliance-based exercise and a race to the bottom. So I think what we've seen with other types of certifications, whether it be, PCI, I think is a good example, in the payment card industry, where you end up playing a lot of certification games, and in fact, the first few versions of the standard failed because it was self-attestation, and so it became pretty much a race to the bottom to determine how payment card data would be secured. So we got to be careful about that.
Thank you. Anybody to add on this topic?
I just wanted to add that there's also really a worldview problem here. So you have the American worldview, which is summed up by the traditional saying that the scariest phrase in the English language is "We are the government. We are here to help." So that's the American view, and then there's the European view, which is embodied by the European Commission, and I trust I should not talk about that any further. It can be mandated. In fact, it's actually well underway to become a mandatory structure for some fields. The question is, should it? And the second question is, what should be mandated? Now, specifically regarding that, I would like to point out that the Cybersecurity Act, which has been enacted by the European Commission and the Parliament as one of the last acts of the previous Commission, is now it's the whole process has stopped for a while the new Commission was formed. But over the next year, hearings and requests for comments are going to go out for the start of the creation of the certification criteria for the Cybersecurity Act. If you have not read it, it's probably better for you. But the TLDR of the Cybersecurity Act is that the European Commission, among other things, has decided to create a set of shall we say, industry-specific or vertical-specific certifications to be defined at a later stage through other acts that will apply across the European market so that they are common. And in the next couple of years, these certification schemes are going to be created. And one thing that usually happens is that when I go and work in one of these bodies that are creating certification schemes for the EU, so for instance, in the latest exercise where I was talking about the cybersecurity of medical devices, there were about 30 people in the room. Very good people, by the way, very focused, very determined to create something that actually worked. So it was a pleasant experience. But there were 2 people with a background in penetration testing out of 30. And by chance, because one of these people was a representative of a standards body that happened to be from a penetration testing shop, and I was an academic that happened to have passed as a penetration tester. So that was just by chance. So when you see pass by calls by ENISA or by the European Commission to enter these interest groups or stakeholders group, do not ignore them, because we as a community ignore them at our peril.
Indeed.
I'd just like to pick up on something Cory said. I'm slightly more optimistic about the race to the bottom, because I think we're already at a bottom, and what we're seeing now is Europe is working on some standards. The U.S. has already passed laws in a couple of states, California and Oregon. The U.K., Canada, they're investigating setting some minimum floor, and right now there is no floor, so you can make devices as terrible as you want and sell them. And we're seeing that lower bar being raised, at least to some minimum. It's not where it should be, I agree, but it's at least a start in the right direction.
So to say this, nobody wants a certification process that's too heavy, also because it's always expensive. So when you have to abide at some rules and you have to follow some processes, and you have to repeat them for each iteration, and that might include the software, then the costs can easily ramp up. So there is a need for the right balance of what you are requiring. And so the idea is that you actually have to hurt companies that do grave mistakes in security, especially by intentional inaction, to hurt, well, where it hurts, so in the pocket. So there might be a system of fines. You don't have to start hurting companies before, otherwise they might even problems entering a market. Yeah. So whereas we do need certification, and it must address a good baseline, not just the bottom, and I think that's a given. It's up to the people setting this process in place to make sure that actually the good work is rewarded and intentional sloppiness is severely dealt with.
Yeah. It's interesting to see that at the same time there are several initiatives which have been initialized. Some countries already talking about mandating regulation. ARM has a PSA certification. Will it be mandated at some point in time, or will it be always on a voluntary basis for your customers, as far as you know?
So I don't know exactly, but usually when we require something, it is in the contract. So
okay.
Not doing what we require basically is a violation of the contract. Now, I'm not in legal, so I do not know the exact wording, and I shall never speak
I'm teasing you
on their behalf. What we are doing anyway, there are different profiles, even though it's a word I don't like very much. And there will be a process by which you get a very specific certification for the usage of the PSA components.
Yeah, last question on this topic. It's interesting that basically it's been done this year right after, let's say, the havoc created by microarchitectural attack with Meltdown, Spectre, and all these things. How much have they had a role in creating a certification for ARM device, if any, at all? Do you have seen any concern growing, and maybe we need to, is there any effect between these two things?
Yes and no. That is definitely a big factor. But when there's one thing actually in ARM that you have to understand, it has a very British academic culture. So everything is debated until everybody is sick of this. And then you continue. As if getting sick in debates is a kind of a virtue or a kind of an internal sport activity.
Yes.
Discussions about adding security processes were definitely accelerated by this.
Yeah.
And well, it was also one of the reasons I'm actually having a little team. I'm not doing my work alone. That has definitely helped, at least avoiding burnout in my case, or delaying in time. But we also learned from the past. I don't want to use the word mistakes, but I mean, so what you observed is that when we introduced Trust Zone, we basically told the partners, hey, this is a new hardware enforced bit. That's how it works. That's how it separates the resources from the non-secure world to the world that is not non-secure. That's the reason for the weird meaning of the NS bits. But then everybody was using this hardware to implement their own trusted execution environment, and many have been broken. And that has somewhat tarnished the reputation of what is actually a perfectly fine hardware architecture. So for the future, we are thinking seriously that new security-related features, if any, I'm not announcing anything here. Another thing I'm not allowed to.
Sure.
Really? But if you will see new security-related features in ARM, there will be also some very strong instructions for use for the partners.
Yeah. The audience, can you please raise hands who thinks that the security certification should be mandated by government? Please raise hands who thinks it's the right approach. Okay, I actually would have expected many more than that.
Controversial.
So do you have any, let's say, hot questions on this topic or controversial questions that you would like to pose to the panel on mandating from government or by other bodies? We still have a few. I just wanted to take just a very quick. As a
government employee, are you out of your mind?
So it's recently come to my attention that at least in the United States, certain certifications actually force companies not to open their source or designs, and I'm kind of worried that having the wrong people in charge of these certifications might lead to similar things happening here. Because at least outside of information security, a lot of people tend to think that sharing your designs will make it easier for people to find problems and just less secure. Do you know any way how to guard against these kind of things?
So, I mean, there's kind of two distinct questions there that I see. One is, should we let the governments decide things? And the question is which government? Because there's definitely ones that I might trust and ones that I don't, and that's a huge debate in of itself. And I lost track of the second question though. Sorry. Oh yeah, so the obfuscation essentially. Security through obscurity is another debate that's been widely debated, and I think I fall on the side of the fence where it doesn't really buy you much. It buys you time, but the bugs will come out eventually. So.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. I was kind of afraid that it might lead to more security for obscurity and therefore actually less secure world.
So, I mean, there's a few aspects of that, being part of a product security team now for many, many years is that I've learned that there's a significant impact of kind of this hype cycle that gets generated by this disclosure of vulnerabilities, or security issues, that pick up a large amount of press that then cycle into government calls for action that then kind of follow this cycle. And so there's always the concern that if you are more transparent, then you might invite more research or more involvement in discussions about your products. And you actually, as someone who just cares about the end result of how secure your products are, you want that discussion. You want that transparency. But the problem is that if the government regulations are fueled by a press cycle fueled by like noisy security researchers that may not necessarily add all the necessary context into what they've discovered and found, you end up with people being gun shy. But I believe that transparency is a critical component to making sure that you're secure.
Yeah, based on this question, we are really approaching the last few moments. One question interesting would be, we keep on asking to test devices, right? While we know that when you test a device, you find some vulnerabilities, then they get fixed, and in the end, sooner or later, they should be certified. Well, we know that for a positive cycle, actually the process in the manufacturer are actually even more important. Do you actually perform review of your code or your design? Do you actually perform external audits? How often? Do you have a program for answering to vulnerabilities and a commitment to patch within 30 days? Finally, do you commit to keep the device patched for the next 5 years? So these are processes which are vendor-wise and are not device-wise. Why don't we consider, rather than testing all the devices, certifying also the vendor's processes? Because so knowing that the vendor actually has these processes makes all the device of the vendor even more secure. What do you think? We a quick round of an idea.
So, I mean, the answer is yes. All of those things need to be audited to make sure that they're secure. The processes, the manufacturing, patching, and when you're doing a holistic test of a device, all of that is in scope. Now, the question is whether or not the client is willing to pay for that, because maybe they didn't allocate enough money for that sort of whole test. And we definitely see that quite frequently, where they just want to get the bare minimum test, and it's just kind of a failure of budgeting.
That's fine. So I won't speak to any particular process, but I think one of the things that we should think about is even in like IoT, or at least in my space in consumer hardware, that still most of the security critical controls are in the service infrastructure layer that drives the hardware. And so when you look at the processes that are used to maintain that service infrastructure or that cloud infrastructure is actually just as important a set of processes to look at rather than just what you do on the hardware side.
Thank you.
Also about the security processes, I wonder, and I am asking myself, and so by extension, so everybody here, whether we might need a certification process for the security development lifecycle. So a kind of ISO 9000 standard for security processes. We have them for safety, we have them for things, even though there is another risk, because security processes must be tailored over to the company culture. I'm moving from Qualcomm, where there was a very specific culture. I see that things are different in ARM. And I even though I'm part of the team that is setting up an SDL for ARM, we can't just copy the other one because the company culture is very different. So the risk with this certification, in this case, which is something I'm split, would be that it might try to impose a methodology which is not the right one for all the cultures. Yeah. And so this is I leave like an open question for everybody to think about.
Do you want to think more about it, Stefano?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out to one thing that I think is clear in everyone's mind in this industry, but it's not outside this industry. That we know that, for instance, security assessment, as you said before very well, it's basically a negative thing, right? You are looking at things and trying to figure out what is wrong. And most of other certifications, like electrical safety or biomedical safety, they are instead predicated on the fact that you can prescribe what you want the product to do. So this difference makes me think that actually the point about we may be better off at certifying some processes with all the caveats that you rightly pointed out. We need to make it general enough, but we may be better at figuring out the processes and giving some prescriptions or some requirements to meet for the processes, then we are at giving out specific requirements for the products. Precisely the same way that ISO 27001 describes a process and not the outcome or the technologies. And I know that the simple mention of ISO 27001 has created a vacuum in the movement.
Even in the moderator, don't worry.
In fact, one thing that I really hate are recipes. People sometimes ask me, what are the things I have to do in order to get something secure? And what I teach in my security risk assessment classes within the company is essentially that there is an approach. Of course, we have to write documents in a very specific way, but you can't really get a recipe. So I always have a slide, because I'm an arrogant know-it-all, so I want to show off a culture with a quote from Machado that is caminante no hay camino, hay que caminar. Al andar se hace el camino, which means walker, there is no path. The path is done. So there is the walking. There is your path is done by walking. And very different products sometimes require you not to bend the rules, but to use them in a different way, and to sometimes find ad hoc mental approaches to test something. So it's very risky. We might need something, but I think we are on the same line here.
Yeah, I'm glad that this is sparking some thoughts that I find constructive. Also, not very often discussed at this level, because very often when you discuss about certification, there are maybe technical details of one certification or another. I think these are general problems. And in order to close a not so controversial but very interesting, panel, I have the last question. Basically, what are your do's and don'ts, very quickly, of certification? So what, in your view, must be there and must not be there in a given certification? Quickly.
So one of the things that I see our most security successful customers doing is they're not interested in the bugs. If we find a bunch of bugs, they'll be like, that's cool, but what are the patterns? If we see these kinds of bugs, let's go find variants of that. And so they'll actually go variant hunting on every kind of bug. And it's that maturity that the big security organizations have, where they'll actually go and hunt down all of the patterns. And that by and large squashes entire classes of issues, and that's far more successful than just hitting the ones and twos.
I have to do self-regulate. Our industry needs to come up with reasonable standards that we can offer. The government says, hey, this is a reasonable standard, because don't let them regulate us, because that's not something we want. With the obvious exception of my employer that pays my salary, all governments are equally bad at certifying things and mandating structures.
So I have one don't. Common criteria.
Which is exactly the same thing I was saying with a specific example.
Don't-common criteria is nice. Don't. It's arriving after Cory, yes?
Yep. So a do would be set an expiration for any certification that exists.
Great.
And a don't would be self-attest.
Yep. Well, I see already a few hands being raised for questions. One is there. Come on, now it's your time. Blast them.
I'd like to make a comment on Roberto's last comment. I can see why you don't want common criteria to be mandated for other industries, because it's too complex and so on. But if you look at the tremendous success in raising the security standard over the past 20 years, I think that's a good starting point. If you get it lean, then it's, I would say, close to perfect, because the smart card industry continuously raised their standards over the past 20 years using a mechanism like common criteria.
Yes, I know. The main problem with common criteria is that it's too much reduced to a checklist sometimes. And the way it is organized sometimes scares people. So I don't want to require something using a very specific language and very rigid process by which the main reaction might be they might be even disturbed in their own development by this. I mean, I've seen people I'm not saying run away when you mention the word, but you see that in the eyes. And it's also because, yes, you can just follow step by step. It gives you a baseline. But sadly, it's not sufficient. You're right, it's a starting point. I think we can also skip the starting points and start with something even better. If you have nothing else, okay. What do you mean?
What would be an alternative?
Maybe.
We're out of time.
We can take one more question because we are actually over time.
Yep.
So I was one of the few people who raised their hands when you asked whether governments should be imposing security standards on businesses. And one of the reasons for this is obviously I come a bit more from the hardware field, and within Europe there's the CE requirement. This is a self-test mostly, but within hardware this has created a lower bar, which is actually significantly higher than what we've seen previously coming in, for instance, over eBay and AliExpress from China, as far as hardware goes. And this has created these very common companies that do the certification for you, that know exactly what they have to do to review your design, to test your design against the relevant fields, and this has become very affordable. This is not just, I've heard you say it shouldn't become like a checkbox feature, not something that you just check off and then it's gone and you don't do holistic design. But those companies that are very specialized do actually do very comprehensive, very holistic design reviews on your hardware, of course. And they're still affordable for a company without your company actually needing all this expertise in-house. So from this perspective, looking at it from a hardware point of view, it seems to be possibly effective. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Your observation is accurate, of course, but I think it works best in a very narrow focus. Like when you look at like electrical safety, for example, they're concerned about the safety of the electrical equipment, and that's it. Whereas the things that we're talking about here are generic and apply in so many different areas and so many different industries. It's kind of hard to make one safety or security standard that applies.
Well, thank you very much also for this interaction. Our time is up, so I would like to thank you for staying here at the panel. I hope you enjoyed and you found this interesting. Of course, you can find ourselves in the panelists just outside when we are finished. Well, have a good continuation. Thank you.